Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this meeting of Troy City Council for January 3rd, 2022. Happy New Year, everybody. My name is William Lutz. I'm President of Council. I will lead us in our invocation, our Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this new year, and Lord, we are grateful. Lord, for this council, for the next 2 years, I hope that you bestow upon us the awesome sense of responsibility to act with courage, honor, and conviction to ensure that all of our residents, all of our employees, all of our neighbors can live a life filled with responsibility, dignity, and respect. It is in the name, amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Whidden? Mr. Twiss?
Here.
Mrs. Snee? Here. Mr. Schilling?
Present.
Mr. Roselle?
Here.
Mr. Pierce?
Here.
Mr. Phillips?
Here.
Mrs. Marshall?
Here.
Mr. Sievert?
Entertain a motion to excuse Mr. Sievert.
Second.
It's been moved to excuse Mr. Sievert by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twiss?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Roselle?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Here.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Sievert is excused.
Move to excuse Mr. Whidden.
Second.
It has been moved to excuse Mr. Whidden. A motion made by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Roselle. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Roselle?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Twiss?
Yes.
Mr. Whidden is excused.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We move on to a few housekeeping items for the first council meeting of this term. We begin with Ordinance 01-2022. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the ordinance?
Ordinance number 01-2022, ordinance employing clerk of council and fixing compensation. This would be the same term as council through December 31, 2023. First reading.
Does council wish to dispose of the item?
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Schilling, seconded by Mr. Phillips. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Mr. Roselle?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Twiss?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Move to adopt.
Second.
It's been moved to adopt the ordinance by Mr. Roselle, seconded by Mr. Schilling. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Roselle?
Yes.
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Twiss?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
Yes.
Ordinance is adopted.
Wonderful. Welcome back, Mrs. Knight. We are happy to have you. I know we're
Thank
all
you.
looking forward to working with you.
Thank you.
This time I will ask Mr. Kerber to conduct the oath of office to the clerk of council, Mrs. Knight.
She knows the oath pretty well, so
Yeah.
I'm going to just ask her to stand and raise her right hand and please set forth your oath.
I, Sue Knight, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of Ohio, that I will faithfully, honestly, and impartially discharge the duties of the office of Clerk of Council, City of Troy, State of Ohio, during my continuance in said office.
That's pretty good for the first time.
Thank you.
All right, this time we'll move on to the election of the president of council pro tem.
Mr. President?
Yes,
I
Mr.
move-
Twiss.
I move, or motion to elect President of Council Pro Tem for Bobby Phillips.
Second.
It has been moved to elect Mr. Phillips, council president pro tem by Mr. Twiss, seconded by Mrs. Snee. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
Yes.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall?
Yes.
Mr. Twiss?
Yes.
Mrs. Snee?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
He voted for Bob.
I've already voted. Who did I vote for?
Bobby.
Bobby, I'm sorry. Go ahead, you can vote for me. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sure. Yes.
Mr. Roselle?
Yes.
Motion is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Congratulations, Mr. Phillips.
Thank you.
Moving on to the election of Clerk of Council Pro Tem.
Mr. President,
Mr. Phillips.
I'd like to nominate Mrs. Snee as our Clerk Pro Tem.
Excellent. Is there a second?
Second.
It has been moved to elect Mrs. Snee as Council Clerk Pro Tem by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Twiss. Any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Twiss.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Motion is approved.
Wonderful. Congratulations, Mrs. Snee. This time we'll move on to have council approve the rules of council. Rules have been provided. Any comments or questions? Mr. Phillips.
So moved to adopt those.
Second.
It has been moved to adopt the rules of council by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Mr. Twiss.
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce.
Yes.
Mr. Phillips.
Yes.
Rules are adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. This time we have a special introduction. I will hand it over to Mr. Titterington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mark, if you could please stand, or maybe not bow, but stand. I'd like to introduce Mark Wendling. Mark started today as the Assistant Director of Public Service and Safety. He was most recently Fairfield City Manager for 5 years. Prior to that, he served 4 years as the Assistant City Manager in Fairfield. He has done management jobs in Silverton and Silverton, Ohio, Independence, Kentucky. Overall, he has more than 30 years in local public service. He has a bachelor's and master's at Northern Kentucky University, where he is a distinguished alum. He is married with 2 children. He has been involved with numerous professional and service organizations, but certainly the best accolade is that he is a Rotarian. So I do want to ask that you welcome Mark.
Absolutely.
And hopefully he will be here for a long time.
Welcome, Mr. Wendling. I can see that we share the same barber, so. I am curious, will this be Mr. Funderburg's last evening with us?
Yes, it will.
And Tom, thank you so much for all you've done. And for those folks watching at home, which I know there are hundreds, if not thousands, Tom is the one that keeps us all in line. He's our producer extraordinaire of this fine YouTube broadcast. Thank you for all you've done, Tom. We really appreciate it. All right, moving on to the summary of minutes. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the minutes of the December 20th, 2021 meeting of Troy City Council?
Yes, sir. Minutes of Council, December 20, 2021. Committee reports. Community and Economic Development Committee recommended legislation be prepared to approve the subdivision regulations as amended, and there was a discussion on the subject. Finance Committee recommended legislation be prepared approving the application of ConAgra Foods Packaged Foods to participate in the Employee Creation Incentive Plan. Law and Ordinance Committee gave an oral report about the D2 liquor permit for Bob Evans. Personnel Committee reported on a number of board appointments, and all were approved. That included reappointments to the Income Tax Board of Review, the Economic Development Revolving Loan Fund Review Committee, the CIC, the Board of Zoning Appeals, and the Human Relations Commission. Ordinance number 072, 2021. Approving expansion project agreement filed by ConAgra Foods for the Employee Creation Incentive Program, first reading and adopted. Ordinance number 072, 2021. Amending the subdivision regulations was given first title. The ordinance failed suspension and failed a motion to amend. Ordinance 073, 2021. Establish Robinson Reserve at Duke Park Fund was given first reading and adopted. Following various comments, the outgoing members of council, Mr. Swayzer and Mr. Twilliger, were recognized, and then council adjourned at 7:40 p.m.
Move to approve.
Mr. President,
Mr. Phillips.
question before I
Yes.
second that motion. Mrs. Knight, on tonight's minutes, off of the minutes you were reading there, or off of tonight's agenda and the disposition of ordinances and resolution sheet, you've got 073-2021.
It should be 072.
It should, okay. I just wanted to make sure that
Yes.
that was correct.
You are correct.
Thank you. Then I will second that motion.
Yeah, just to bring everybody up to speed, it looks like we have 07221 twice in the minutes.
Yes.
Okay. Any further comments or questions?
I do not know who made the,
Mr. Rozell moved
Thank
to
you.
approve the minutes. Mr. Phillips made the second after his brief comments. Any further comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall.
Yes.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Moving on to committee reports. It is my honor to have our first committee report, an oral report from our Personnel Committee, his first committee report, and Mr. Pierce. Mr. Pierce, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mayor Oda has requested approval of the appointment of Kenny Block to the Human Relations Commission for a term through December 31st, 2024. The committee supports the request. I move that council approves the appointment of Kenny Block to the Human Relations Committee with a term that would commence immediately and run through December 31st, 2024.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. It's been moved to approve the appointment by Mr. Pierce, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Any comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Twist.
Yes.
The motion is approved.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. We have one resolution and two ordinances for discussion this evening. If you wish to address council on any of those items, now is the time to do so. Please come to the podium, give your name and address. You have 2 minutes to address council. Seeing none, we'll move on to resolutions. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the first resolution of the evening, Resolution R1, 2022?
Resolution number R1, 2022, resolution authorizing the sale during calendar year 2022 of municipally owned personal property which is not needed for public use or which is obsolete or unfit for the use for which it was acquired by internet auction pursuant to Ohio Revised Code Section 721.15D. This is an annual piece of legislation authorizing us to use these internet auctions through the year as council may declare items as surplus. First reading.
Move to suspend.
Second.
It's been moved to suspend the three reading rule by Mr. Twist, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Schilling,
Yes.
Mr. Rozell.
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee.
Yes.
I move to adopt.
Second.
The three reading rule has been suspended. It's been moved to adopt the resolution by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Are there any final comments or questions? Mrs. Knight, please call the roll.
Mr. Rozell,
Yes.
Mr. Pierce,
Yes.
Mr. Phillips,
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall,
Yes.
Mr. Twist,
Yes.
Mrs. Snee,
Yes.
Mr. Schilling.
Yes.
Resolution is adopted.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Mrs. Knight, will you please read the first ordinance of the evening, Ordinance 073, 2021?
Ordinance number 073, 2021. An ordinance repealing Title III, Part 11, subdivision regulations of the codified ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio, and enacting new Title III, Part 11 subdivision regulations of the codified ordinances of the City of Troy, Ohio. This has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. It is the second reading.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. I know Mr. Schilling had a few comments he wanted to make, so Mr. Schilling, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Over the last week, first I'd like to apologize to council. When I brought this up a couple of weeks ago, I had started reading this 130-page ordinance at 4:30 in the afternoon before council. So I didn't have a whole lot of time to digest all this and share my concerns with other members of council and the city staff. And for that, I apologize. We're talking about the word morals in this 130-page document. And the word morals is not defined in the Ohio Revised Code, nor in any ordinance in the City of Troy's code. The word morals is not included in the original ordinance adopted by Troy City Council in 1930. It was added at a later date. The phrase "to help promote and maintain the public health, safety, comfort, morals, convenience, and general welfare of persons working and living in the city" can be found in section 731.10 of the Ohio Revised Code adopted in 1953. Section 713 deals with the formation of the Planning Commission and the establishment of the Commission's authority and responsibilities. The word prosperity is used in lieu of the word morals in section 713.06, 713.07, 73.08, and section 73.09. All these sections deal with the powers and authority of the Planning Commission. All these sections were adopted at the same time. Why was the word included in one section and not the other four? The cities of Sidney, Piqua, Tip City, Vandalia, and Englewood all have ordinances governing their subdivisions. All ordinances have the same aspirational phrase as the City of Troy's, minus the word morals. I could not find the phrase in Huber Heights codified ordinance, and there was no mention of the word morals. Did the City of Troy somehow miss the memo directing other Ohio cities to delete the word morals? Bear with me here. Okay. The phrase has been described by our city law director as aspirational, with the implication that the phrase has no power or authority. Aspire means to direct one's hopes and ambitions to achieve a goal. But our city law director also believes that the phrase gives the city proper and permissible function to enforce the subdivision regulations. He suggests that the word moral should not be removed from the section, as he feels that the word is needed in the toolbox just in case. And I apologize, Mr. Kerber, for paraphrasing there. I am not sure if we can have it both ways. Is the word meaningless and without authority as implied, or does the phrase in total give the city the authority to try and achieve the stated goals, including the stated goal of improving public morals? If the phrase has real authority and the city decides to aspire to achieve a goal of promoting and maintaining public morals, and the city has the authority to try and achieve this goal through issuing regulations, then what doors does this open? If City Council does not strike the word morals from the revised ordinance, does this phrase give the city the authority to declare certain acts like abortions immoral and to establish sections in this ordinance regulating a declared immoral act? I believe that some very interesting legal briefs could be written on both sides of this issue. But the City Council, with the wrong vote, want to place the city in the middle of this debate. It has been argued that morals are regulated by the City of Troy all the time. The forced closing of the strip club is a prime example given. The strip club was not closed because it was immoral. It was closed because it violated the laws set forth in the Ohio Revised Code regulating such establishments, and not by any morals ordinance passed by Troy City Council. Had the owners followed the Ohio law, the business might still be in operation today. The ban on medical marijuana sales and production was also given as an example. Public health and safety were concerns expressed by City Council when the ban option authorized by the Ohio Revised Code was placed into effect. Immorality was never discussed. Okay. Most of our laws regulating behavior are established by the Ohio legislature through the Ohio Revised Code. Early in our country's history, colonies attempted to regulate morals directly. These attempts failed and were abandoned. You no longer wear scarlet letters unless you're an Ohio State Buckeye fan. Today, several years ago, the Ohio legislature removed several sections of the revised code dealing with morals issues. Today, society classifies these deleted sections as offensive and discriminatory. Over the past year, Troy City Council has heard from our residents expressing their beliefs in their individual rights and freedoms. Whether masks or vaccines or any other issues we have discussed, the message from our residents is loud and clear. While the city of Troy is a wonderful place to live, the residents do not want the city to regulate certain aspects of their lives. I do not believe that the majority of the residents of the city of Troy subdivisions want the city of Troy to direct its ambitions to achieve the goal of improving the morals of the residents. The revised subdivision regulations are covered in detail in over 130 pages and 100,000 words. Removing the one word, morals, from the proposed ordinance, as other cities in our area have done, or replacing it with the new word prosperity, will not damage or weaken the ordinance in any way. Removing the word morals will say to the residents of Troy that we as City Council respect your individual rights and freedom and honor our commitment to help govern Troy by not overstepping our boundaries with undefined, unnecessary, unenforceable, and unwanted regulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schilling. Any further comments or questions? How does council wish to dispose of the item?
Move to suspend the rules.
It's been moved to suspend, and it has been seconded to suspend the three reading rule. The motion made by Mr. Phillips, seconded by Mr. Rozell. Mrs. Knight, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Pierce?
No.
Mr. Phillips?
Yes.
Mrs. Marshall? Yes. Mr. Twist?
Yes.
Mrs. Snead?
Yes.
Mr. Schilling?
No.
Mr. Rozell?
Yes.
Failed suspension.
The item not receiving the required number of votes, the item is not suspended and will move on to a third reading. Mrs. Knight, will you please read ordinance 02, 2022?
Ordinance number 02, 2022. An ordinance changing the zoning of parcel number D08099763 in lot 7392 in the city of Troy, Ohio, from M2 Light Industrial District to B1 Local Retail District. This rezoning has been recommended for approval by the Troy Planning Commission. There will be a public hearing at the next council meeting.
Thank you, Mrs. Knight. Since there will be a public hearing on this at our next meeting, this will be held over for a second and third reading. Moving on to communications and announcements. Mrs. Knight, are there any?
No, sir.
Moving on to comments of officials. Mayor Oda.
I just wish everybody a happy new year and hope we have a successful 2022.
Thank you, Mayor. I will note that council did receive your annual report before the meeting tonight. Moving on to Director of Public Service and Safety, Mr. Titrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of housekeeping items, I guess. Since we have new council members and anticipating that every year about this time we do hear from our constituents, just a reminder to speak into the mic and speak loudly and proudly. Second is Martin Luther King Day is Monday, January 17th. City Hall is closed, but trash and recycling is on schedule. Third, I would echo your comments earlier, Mr. Lutz, and thank Tom. It is his last meeting. He has had 15 years with the city of Troy, all of them exemplary. His last day is Friday, but I know I speak for many, if not all, in saying that I hope he stays active because he is positive and he is big on Troy, and that's the kind of people that we want involved. So thank you, Tom. That's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Titrington. Moving on to Director of Law, Mr. Herbert.
I also want to commend Tom Thunderbird for his service. I worked with Tom quite a bit, and if he wasn't always calm, he at least always appeared calm. He was just a rock to work with, and he will be missed. But I hope to see you and Susan around. And all right, that's all I have.
Thank you, Mr. Herbert. Any council members have any comments that they would like to add at this time?
If I may.
Mr. Phillips.
Thank you. Again, Tom, you are a good friend. You are a most outstanding person and an asset to this city. And you've got big shoes to fill, as I mentioned when I first met you, sir. So, Tom, thank you for your service and whatever your endeavors are. Good luck.
Same thing, Tom. They've all used all the adjectives. I just think it's great to see people that chose to stay in Troy or to return and serve, and that's great.
Excellent. Any other council members, any comments? Oh, thank you, Mrs. Sneed. I would happily announce the council committees for the next 2 years. On our finance committee, it will be chaired by Mr. Sievert, with Mr. Phillips and Mr. Rozelle on the committee. Our law and ordinance committee will be headed by Mrs. Sneed, with Mr. Phillips and Mr. Sievert on the committee. Our community and economic development committee will be chaired by Mr. Schilling, with Mr. Pierce and Mrs. Snee on the committee. Our community partnerships committee will be chaired by Mr. Rozelle. He will be joined by Mr. Schilling and Mr. Sievert. Our buildings and utilities committee will be chaired by Mrs. Marshall. She will be joined by Mr. Twiss and Mr. Whidden. Our streets and sidewalks committee will be chaired by Mr. Phillips, and Mr. Pierce and Mrs. Snee will also serve on that committee. Our safety and health committee will be chaired by Mr. Twiss. He will be serving along with Mrs. Marshall and Mr. Whidden. Our personnel committee, we've already met the chair already, Mr. Pierce, and he will be serving along with Mrs. Marshall and Mr. Twiss. Our final committee, the Parks and Recreation Committee, will be chaired by Mr. Whidden, and he will be serving along with Mr. Rozelle and Mr. Schilling. Thank you, Ellen. Do we have any staff members in the audience who would like to make any comments tonight? Seeing none, we move on to the audience portion of the comments. If you wish to address council on any issue, please come up to the lectern, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume.
Good evening, members of council, Mr. President. My name is Bradley Bering. I live at 105 Crestwood Drive. I want to make sure that gets correct in the minutes because last couple minutes I've seen, it's been listed as 180.
Oh, okay.
So it is 105.
Thank you, Mr. Barry.
Thank you. It happens. It's an honest mistake. I can't get mad about that.
All your fan mail's going to the other end.
Or my hate mail, whichever. Well, here we are at a new year, 2022. And as I think back over the last years of coming up here to these meetings, we've been through a heck of a lot of us as a city, haven't we? Some good, some bad, but we've all got through it. And I just want to say some things, my hopes and aspirations for the coming year. We must never forget that the reason we have these governments is because of the people that they govern. We elect people to represent us. And I don't live inside the city limits, so you may say, well, I don't have a dog in the fight. And I don't, theoretically. But I believe in good government. I'd say to you, keep this in mind. Don't ever let it go to your head. And to you two new people, I don't think that you will. Christy, I know you well enough. I know you won't. I just have a couple questions regarding some things that have happened within the last year. What is the update on the moratoriums, particularly with the review of the demolition standards as was set forth in the 180-day moratorium over the last year? Can you...
Mr. Tittington, can you address that?
Just that staff is reviewing that and doing the research, and eventually we will bring those to Planning Commission with a possible recommendation to the council.
All right.
Okay, has there been input from the public on those, Mr. Titterington?
No, there would be public input if it comes to the council or if the Planning Commission decides to have a public hearing. But if it does go to council, then there would be a mandatory public hearing as part of that.
Okay. Secondly, we've been talking a lot about the subdivision regulations tonight and at the last meeting. And I'm just kind of curious, has the city of Troy ever looked at doing, or have they ever done, a comprehensive land use plan such as the plan at Piqua plan that was done several years ago in the city of Piqua? And if not, are we looking at doing such a thing?
Mr. Tittington, do you care to address that?
Yes.
I'm giving them all to you tonight, Mr. Tittington.
We do have a comprehensive plan. It's available for viewing on the city's website.
And how recent is that?
Within the last 5 years.
Okay. Well, that's pretty much what I needed to know. And I'd like to close my thoughts tonight with something that is said at the end of every state opening of Parliament overseas in England by the Queen. And I think it's very apropos here. Since we open our meetings with an invocation, I'd like to close my thoughts with this. My sincere prayer for all of you in the year 2022 is that the blessings of Almighty God may rest on your councils. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barringer. Anyone else wish to address council this evening? You're more than welcome to come forward, give your name and address, and take as much time as you wish to consume. Seeing none, our meeting is adjourned. I will remind folks that our next meeting will be on Tuesday, January 18th. We will not be meeting on Monday in observation of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Thank you very much for attending. Have a safe trip home.